Hello and welcome to my developer walkthrough video for the beta of Yok.AI. I'm Michele and I'm the main and only engineer for the game. In this video we'll be talking about mainly the code and implementation of the player, the enemies, the time stop mechanic, the bosses, the dialogue system, the save system, the UI, and general implementations of things I didn't do such as VFX because I had to put them in certain tags, for example. Okay, so starting with the player, we're using the new input system in Unity, and we are using it through the new input system events, which means that when you press the specific button, such as the attack, which would be A on an Xbox controller, X on an Xbox controller, it would execute the code of the public function attack. Same for time stop 1, dash, time stop, heal, etc., etc. Oddly enough, the only thing that is not made with the new input system is the movement. The movement was implemented before we added the new input system to Unity, and just therefore only uses the vertical and horizontal axis of Unity itself. This works perfectly fine both with keyboard, using either WASD or arrow keys, as well as an Xbox controller and any other controller. Then, for the attacks of the player, there are 3 moves that all can be done in chain. The first one will happen when you press X, which will activate the attack A function that will simply turn on a hitbox that is in front of the player, in this case this huge hitbox, and then turn it off through an animation event. Now, what it will do is it will play the animation, and the animation will do the animation event. Sorry. There are a lot of things to keep track of. Then, for the player attack animations, as you can see, all the events are here, and there are a lot. There are events specifically set up so that the player can execute attack chains, and if he doesn't want to, it will just play the animation. But if he wants to do the attack chain, he will press the X button again and will activate a bool on the animator that will make it so the attack chain continues. Then that is more or less it for the attacks, and now let's talk about the dash. The dash will let the player be invincible to any kind of attacks. They will still collide with him, just no damage taken. And you can see the dash in this public void. But what it basically does, it changes the tag and the layer to be called invincible, and both serve different functions. Mainly the tag is for detecting attacks that will, when they collide with the player will not receive damage, and the layer is for things like lasers or ice walls that cannot be dodged otherwise. So that is more or less it for the player. I'm kind of going fast through all of this because there is a lot to talk about. Now, these are all the 3 main and regular enemies. The main and regular enemies just use nav mesh for movement and have the player set as their goal. And for the 2 melee enemies, they have smaller hitboxes, as you can see, that will make it so once the player enters into those hitboxes, it will deactivate the nav mesh and then attack. And then in the attack animation, they have animation events to activate the hitboxes of the attacks. But for the ranged enemy, he has a much bigger hitbox, or area as you prefer, that will make it so it keeps following the player until it enters this hitbox. Once it's in, it will start the animation to shoot, which is constantly looping, until the player gets out of the hitbox. So this enemy will only shoot to the player if it is inside of the hitbox, unless it gets pushed through knockback from the player mid-shooting animation. you can hopefully see the animation here for the shooting, which was not made by me. The only thing was a specific animation event. And then all the enemies share the same health script called health that will just have public functions that make it so once they enter, once the player hitbox, attack hitbox, detects an enemy inside it, it will get the information from that enemy and then get the code to execute this function of getting hit. It will lower the HP, and then once the HP is less than 0, it will die and leave an explosion after it. Okay, so that's more or less it. No, I'm missing the bullet for the shooting enemies, which is this one right here. And once the shooting enemies shoot, they instantiate this bullet and give it a force to its rigid body so that it launches forward and hits the player. There's no animation to that. It's that simple. Okay, now we're done with the enemies, our basic enemies, and it's time to go to the time stop mechanic, probably the most complicated part about this game. So, as you may know, once the player hits the LB and RB buttons on the controller, or Q and E in the keyboard, the game will freeze everything except for the player. We can't really do setting the time scale to 0 because there are many scripts and other animations, especially from the player, that still have to play. So, what we have to do is that each and every entity that is affected by time stop, such as the enemies, the bosses, the bullets, other stage hazards, will send information to the time manager script that has different arrays for the different scripts. So upon spawning, it will find the time manager object and send to the time manager script the information to add to that specific array corresponding to the script. And then once it dies, it will send information through this array extensions method script to remove it from the array so that it doesn't break anything. It is very convoluted, but it had to be done like this. Then, when you stop time, which is this public function called change time, if the requirements are met, meaning that if you have power on the time stop bar, or you're still alive, then it will basically do a for each loop for each and every single one of the arrays, except for like bosses. Those are specific. It will execute a function set on the script, except for this explosion, because there were complications there. But like it will set a function on the script of each and every single one of the arrays to, for the most part, set the animation speed to 0. And for the bullet, just set the force to 0. And same with the bosses. And then, once time comes back, it will do the same thing just to reset all the enemies and bosses and bullets and stage hazards, etc., etc., etc. And then, also, since you have to press 2 buttons at the same time, I had to make it 2 different functions for each button that will start a coroutine of 1/10 of a second. And if you press both buttons in the 1/10 of a second, it works. Simple as that. Next, the 3 bosses. So, for these 3 bosses, unlike for the enemies, we're not using navmesh, we're using root motion and a script called look at that will basically just look at the player constantly. Because that way we could make sure that the player was facing, that the boss was facing the player when he was doing certain moves, or when he wasn't doing certain moves. Then, all of them have a state machine. For the most part, they are very similar, but they may differ in some values. So basically, what happens is that, for example, in this first boss, if the player gets inside this huge hitbox, it will choose between one of 3 attacks and execute it. Like, it will choose between one of 3 attacks, and then the state will change to that specific attack so that it's not doing other things meanwhile. Then, nope, let me open the state machine. As you can see, no, that's the projectile spawn. We'll talk about that later. State there it is. As you can see, there are a lot of states for the first boss, mainly because it has 2 phases and has by far the most attacks. So basically, aside for like the idle states, every single other state is an attack. So once the player enters the hitbox, it will do one of these attacks depending on phase. But if it stays inside the hitbox, or if it stays outside of the hitbox, it has a coroutine that happens every 0.8 seconds that will choose a random state / attack. They mainly vary in the amount of time and how big the hitbox is per boss. As you can see, this one has a bigger hitbox than this one, because this one is mostly a ranged enemy. This one has a similar hitbox to the other one because it's also more of a melee fight. What else? Yes, there are some moves. No, actually, we'll talk about this later. For the moves to activate hitboxes and look at player and stuff like that, they are all animation events. Sorry. That will, like, for example, this one. You can see that it jumps, and then here it stops looking at the player. Here it activates the hitbox, and here it spawns an explosion underneath the maze. And that's more or less the same thing for each boss. It's just different hitboxes and different projectiles. And speaking of projectiles, each boss has a projectile spawn script that has all the prefabs for each boss for the projectiles, and also positions where the projectile should spawn. Because, like, for example, some projectiles have to spawn from the tip of the maze, and some others have to spawn from the center of the boss. I think this one is a better showcase than the first one, because it has center spawner that is higher up than the feet, and then it also has where is it? The weapon spawner that is on the tip of the weapon that will spawn, like, for example, well, tinier projectiles. Then each boss has, of course, many attacks, but all of them have, like, a very big attack that can only be done after a certain amount of attacks have already happened. An example that you may already know is, like, the first boss doing the spin in the center, or spawning lightning, and the second boss just shoulder bashing around the place. I will try to show you the one for the third boss, but again, it's kind of random, so it may take a while. Because what the third boss does is that it spawns ice walls around the player to corner them, but the player can't look. It's going to happen. Spawns ice walls, and then it destroys them, but the player can dash through the wall to avoid the projectiles that spawn from the ice wall, and then it breaks. So this big cinematic attack only happens after a certain amount of attacks are already done. And yeah, that's basically it from the bosses, I think. Next, the dialogue system. Okay. Yeah, I can showcase it in this scene. We'll look at the main game scene later to show where I positioned everything. Yeah, here. So the dialogue is just basically a trigger that has an interaction script. And once the player enters, it will lock them in place and send a message to a dialogue object that in this case is separate from the trigger, but in the main level is attached to it. And in this script, you have the dialogue and what each person is talking about. And this information will be sent to a dialogue manager script that has all the images and all the text positions where everything has to show up for the thing to happen. Like for example, if I change the name here, you will be able to see that the main character is talking, and then it changes to the specific boss right now. And it also changes like the place of the image, and it highlights which person is talking. The way these dialogue scripts are done is that the dialogue trigger is the one that has information to send to the dialogue manager, but it gets the information from a different dialogue script. That is a public class that has like the names, when the sentence has to change, then the sentences itself, and events that have to happen at the end of certain dialogues, like for example activating a boss. And then the dialogue manager has functions that are called through the trigger, and it starts the dialogue. It shows the text where it has to be because there is this check image function at the end that will check if the name of the speaker is equal to one of the already registered names in the script itself. And if it does, it will show the corresponding image and corresponding name and corresponding dialog box because they all have different ones. It's just a for loop that checks if the name is the same, and if it is, it will do certain things, and if it isn't, it will do others. Okay. And that's pretty much it for the dialogue system. Next we have the save system, which for the save, it will be through these checkpoints that will have specific interactions, so that when you approach them, they have a trigger, and if you press A in that trigger, it will execute a function. This will actually be easier to show in the main scene than in my scene. Yes, because there are so many checkpoints. So once you interact with it, you will send information to a script that the player has attached called player store data that will store the data that is sent to it, and then it will send it does the set checkpoint that will give it the name of the checkpoint, and also I don't remember in which script it was, but also the amount of enemies that the player has killed, etc., etc. And then this will send it to the save system script that will basically just create a save file, and if a save file already exists, it will override it, and then it has a load function that will just get information from the save file and put it on the player store data script, and then just position the player where it has to go and tell it how many enemies the player has already killed. The save file is in binary, not in JSON, mainly because it was more secure. We don't want people tampering with the save file. Then we have the room counter script that is basically checking how many enemies the player has killed, and if it has killed that specific amount of enemies, it will open the doors that just go until the end. The doors will close once the player passes through them to avoid breaking the game, so hopefully that doesn't happen. And if you can see here, the final one is 200, but it actually doesn't. The player will never reach 200 because there aren't 200 enemies. It's just set there as a safe check. There's like, if somehow the player kills more than 56 enemies, we have an extremely high number to make sure the game doesn't break. Finally, we have the UI that is quite simple because it's mainly for the pause menu that will be able to be shown in this specific level. So it's just on the input system. When you press escape, it will activate the pause menu and set the event system to the first button, and then just through a script on the buttons themselves, you will be able to just change through this. And there's the option menu that you can change from full screen to window size and the resolution of the window. It doesn't look the greatest, but like that's on the UI artist side, not me, unfortunately. And if you go controls, it will show the controls. If you hit resume, of course, it will continue playing. And if you press quit, it will go back to the title screen. And the title screen has three options: continue, new game, or quit. But there is a save file check script, as you can see here, that it just checks if there is a save file, and if there isn't a save file, the continue button will disappear and the event system will go to new game instead of continue, so that you are able to navigate through the UI with the controller. I can probably show you the script these have. So basically, as you can see, as you were able to see, the pause menu has an arrow as well, and it has to be set relatively close to the specific button. So it's just through fractions and multiplication instead of just adding X position. It's just a fraction of the position of the button. And then, yeah, that should be it for the things I made. Then I also implemented, as I said, VFX on boss attacks. The main one I know is this one right here. I made the animation for some of the attacks, but are just very basic. And then once the VFX was done, I made sure that it worked with the attack itself, because all these walls are hitboxes and they had to scale properly to it, to the VFX, etc., etc., etc. And then also, for example, this one. Well, it's a VFX rather than that. Yeah, it sends these balls of wind, and just making sure the VFX are implemented correctly. Then on the final level, basically all the gameplay part is me. I did it. And to spawn the enemies, there are just simply triggers, or the dialogue triggers, that once you finish talking, they will spawn the enemies. And then I set the checkpoints. I made sure the nav mesh worked correctly. I made sure there was a light on the level, because there wasn't on the alpha. And I made sure the bosses could not escape from their respective rooms, same as the player. And made sure that the room counter didn't break, because that broke a lot of times. And also made the animation for the second boss has a special arena that is very high up in the air, and will just raise the platform once the player goes there, steps on the arena, and the player to the platform and go up. And then also, like, I don't know what else I could talk about that is like already pretty obvious, except for the end of the game, which is this checkpoint looking thing that is not actually a checkpoint, but it's the only thing you can interact with after you've killed the final boss. That will behave the same, kind of similar to a checkpoint, that if you're close to it and press A, it will switch the scene to the end scene. That I can show you here in a second. Just want to make sure I don't break anything with the scene. Okay, cool. And the final scene is called the end, that you will hopefully see when you play the build. That is just thanks for playing with the credits of each person. I made this. It's a functional credit screen, but again, we still need the UI artist to finish it. And if you press back to title, it will bring you back to the title screen, and if you press quit, it will quit the game. Same with the quit button on the title screen. And yeah, that's about it. Like, there's a lot of stuff, and the video is probably very long, but I can't really talk about it much faster, I'm sorry. Anyways, thank you for listening to my rant. Hey, see ya.